everyone, I am Vibha Chauhan and welcome to Chauhan Classes Funda Clear. So from today I am going to start a new class history, that is class 9th history, and in this video we will discuss about the chapter 1 of it. So as you know that in the 6th, 7th and 8th history what we have studied is about the Indian history, the ancient Indian history, the medieval Indian history and the modern history. But now in 9th and 10th history what we are going to study is about India and the contemporary world. That is, we have studied the history of India and now we will look at the history of the world as well. What was happening outside India during the same time. So all that we will discuss in 9th and 10th history. So for the class 9th history, chapter 1 is about the French Revolution. The French Revolution, one of the most common topic of the history. So as you know that the French Revolution that was very important and has brought so many changes in France. And you know that the French Revolution that was a kind of so much events has brought so many changes in the history of France. And many principles of India as well as of many other countries have been inspired from the French Revolution. So what was French Revolution? How did it happen, when it happened, and what were the reasons behind it? All this we will look in this chapter. So let's discuss about French Revolution. So if we look at the flashback of French Revolution, if you look at the French Revolution, you could say that it started on 14th July 1789. So on 14th July 1789, some 7,000 men and women formed their own people's militia. And why did they form? Because the King of France had ordered his troops to move onto the streets of the Paris, of many cities of Paris. And rumors spread that he would soon order his troops to set fire upon his citizens, and because of that some 7,000 men and women formed their own people's militia. And after that they broke in many number of government buildings in search of arms, and several hundred men and women stormed the fortress prison, that is Bastille, and there they, in the hope of hoarded ammunition, they stormed towards the Bastille in the hope of hoarded ammunition. And in the armed fight that followed, the commander of Bastille was killed and the prisoners were released, though there were only 7 of them. But yet Bastille was hated by every person of France, and because it stood for the despotic rule of the king. As you know that it was a fortress prison, so it's obvious that it showed the power, the despotic rule of the king of France. So that's why all people hated during that time. And even after the destruction of Bastille, even after it was destroyed by the citizens, the stone fragments and other leftovers were sold into the markets as a souvenir of its destruction. So you could say that it was hated by every person if leftovers were sold into the market as a souvenir of its destruction. And after that the French Revolution started and many events took place till the execution of the king. So you could say that all this we are going to study. How did it happen? What was the story behind it? We will study in this chapter. So first we will discuss about French society during the late 18th century. French society during the late 18th century. So as you know that in 1789 the French Revolution took place. The first event took place. So in the late 18th century it took place. So first we have to look the situation of French society during the late 18th century. So if we talk about it in 1774, Louis XVI of Bourbon family had took the throne of France. You know that he had ascended the throne and had become the king of France in 1774. He was 20 years old back then and was married to the Austrian princess Marie Antoinette. So he was married and he was 20 years old. And after that after he took the throne of France, he found the empty treasury, a kind of empty treasury. So there were many reasons behind the empty treasury. Why was that money, why was the treasure of the France was empty? There were many reasons. So as you know that many wars had took place, had been drained before him, before taking the throne, and what happened was that the treasure was lessening. The treasure was becoming less and lesser. And you know that France had helped 13 American colonies to be free of the common enemy, Britain. As you know that during that time Britain had made many colonies in the parts of the world, and it was a kind of common enemy of both France and America, and because of that France had helped America to be free, 13 colonies of America to be free of common enemy Britain, and that also took to the borrowing of treasure money from other lenders to the France, and there were many such costs that led to the empty treasury, that were maintaining the immense palace of Versailles. You know that the palace of Versailles, that is known all over the world, was so much costly. The costly charges of it were so much, and the maintaining the universities, roads, maintaining the troops, army, all this was so much costly, and because of that the treasure was becoming more and more emptier. And because of that the king thought of making, he could see only one way to fill his treasure, and that was to increase taxes, because the condition was becoming more and more hectic, because the France had borrowed money from the lenders, and the lenders who had given the credit to the state were now charging interest. You know that 10% interest was charged, and because of that the Louis XVI, who was the king during that time, thought of increasing tax. But that was also not okay, because during that time, during the old regime is a term used for the institutions and society of France during the that late 18th century. So you could say that in the old regime there were three estates. The French society was divided into three estates, and in the first estate who lived were clergy. Clergy were the people who were invested with some special functions of the church, and in the second estate who lived were nobility, as you know that nobles, and in the third estate they were, you could say that, big businessmen, lawyers, court officials, judges, and there were many persons like peasants, artisans, poor peasants and artisans. So you could say that in the third estate middle class families and the lower caste families were lived. But the problem here was that only third estate had to pay taxes. First estate and second estate were, were privileged by the birth. Clergy and nobility were privileged by the birth, and the most function was that they were exempted from paying taxes to the state. And you know that nobility who had their own feudal dues from the third estate people, and the third estate people didn't have to give taxes only directly to the state, that were tally taxes. Tally taxes were charged on the third estate people directly to the state, and there were many other taxes as well, like to the nobility there were feudal dues, and to the clergy there were taxes, that was tithes. Tithes was a tax that was 1/10 of the agricultural produce has to be given to the clergy people. So you could say that there was not okay situation of French society during the late 18th century, because only third estate has to pay taxes, and only that farmers made 90% of the population of the France back then, and they had to pay taxes. The taxes, you could say that, were extracted from them by many persons, like from nobles, clergy, indirect taxes as well, like in the items like salt, tobacco, these things, and directly to the state as well. So you could say that only third estate has to pay taxes. First and second estate people were privileged by the birth. And in third estate, first and second estate, they were richer people of the society. In the third estate, there were less educated people as well as educated people. There were, you could say that, rich people as well as poor people. So that was the situation of the French society during the late 18th century. So you have looked the situation of French society during the late 18th century. Now next we will discuss about the struggle to survive. The struggle to survive. So as you know that the population of France, that was 23 million in 1715, rose to 28 million in 1789. You could say that it was a rapid increase in the population, and because of that there were high demands of food grains. So it's obvious that there would be high demands of food grains, but the production of food grains did not keep pace with the growing population. That means the population was so much, but the food grains, the production of food grains was not that much, and because of that the price of bread, that bread, as you know that was the main staple diet of France during that time, rose very rapidly. So the price was so much high of bread, of piece of bread, and the wages of persons, laborers, peasants did not keep pace with the high rising prices. So you could say that population increased and the wages did not keep pace, and because of high rising prices, you know that wages did not keep pace with the high rising prices, and this led to subsistence crisis in France, because many times what happened was that the production was even so much worsened due to drought or hail. So that led to subsistence crisis, a situation that happened frequently in the old regime. So what was subsistence crisis and how a subsistence crisis happens? How a subsistence crisis happens? So if we talk about subsistence crisis means an extreme situation where the basic means of livelihood are endangered. So you could say that basic means of livelihood, that is water or food grains, that are the basic means of livelihood, and they are endangered. If they are endangered, then that situation would be called as subsistence crisis. That happened in France during the old regime very frequently. So if we look at subsistence crisis, how it happens, so let's see how it happens. So first you could say that there is less food grains, less production of food grains, then what there would be scarcity of grains, then what would there be? Food prices, the high rising prices of food grains, and after that the poorer can no longer buy bread. I am saying because it was the majority stable diet. So the poorest can no longer buy the food grains or the bread, and that would lead to two things, that is food riots or the weaker bodies, and because of weaker bodies there would be diseases or epidemics, and the food riots and diseases led to the more increased number of deaths. So this is how a subsistence crisis happens. You could say that because of less production, because of scarcity of grain, and because of high rising prices, that was happened. But there was one thing, that was that first and second state were privileged even by the birth, and because of that the gap between poor and the richer was widened because of subsistence crisis, because the prices of bread were high. But for the third state, because they had to pay taxes, but not the first and second state. So you have looked how a subsistence crisis happens. Now next subtopic is a growing middle class envisages an end to privileges. A growing middle class envisages an end to privileges. So you know that in the past, during the late 18th century, in the past, the poor peasants, workers and artisans had participated in the revolts against the increasing taxes and the food scarcity. But they lacked the means of communication and programs to carry out those revolts in a large scale of manner that would bring a change in a social or economic economic order. So that's why this was left to the group of people that were called middle class, that had become prosperous and educated. So this middle class was not as much rich as was nobility and clergy, and although it was not as much as poor as was the peasants, workers and artisans. So it was the middle class group, middle class, that persons, people. They had become prosperous and educated. So as you know that they had become prosperous because their trade was becoming more and more, that bigger overseas. They were trading overseas, and there were also many manufactured goods that they were selling, that they were exporting or importing. So they were exporting overseas their manufactured goods, and that's why they were becoming more and more prosperous. And as I've said that they were educated person as well, that there were many professions like lawyers or the court officials or at the administrative officials. So they were prosperous as well as educated person, and they had seen the ideas of philosophers of equality before law, equality among persons. There were many things that inspired them by the philosophers. The middle class group, middle class people were inspired by the philosophers' ideas, that was equality before law, there should not be there should be democracy, democratic republic. So there were many ideas that inspired them. Like for example, they were inspired by the work, that in his treaty of two governments, John Locke, who was also a philosopher, in his treatise of two governments, he sought to refuse the ideas of, the divine right and divine power of the monarch. So it also inspired this group people, middle class people during that time. And there was a kind of spirit of the laws that was written by Montesquieu, who thought of making of division of powers, that there should be executive, legislature and judiciary part of the government. So that was also inspired, that was also being inspired by the people of third estate. And these inspirings were, that were spread among the people through newspapers, through magazines, and also they were, they were discussed in many shops, in many salons or in the barber shop, and there were many places like cafe, coffee shops, tea stalls. In these shops, these discussions, these ideas were discussed, and they were also spread among the people by many ways of communication, and it was discussed very way aloud because of the people who could not read and write. So it was also spread among those people who could not read or write. So you could say that these ideas of equality among the person, they saw that the middle class families, middle class persons saw that any person should not be privileged just by his birth, just because he was born in nobility or clergy. The person's position should be because of his own merit. So these were the thoughts of the middle class people that were envisaging an end to the privileges, that brought an end to privileges, that will look further in this chapter. So now next topic is the outbreak of the revolution. The outbreak of the revolution. So we have seen the story. Now let's see how the revolution outbroke. So you know that Louis XVI had to increase taxes, and the reasons we have already seen. So he had to increase taxes, and for doing so he didn't have the power to increase tax just by himself alone. He had to increase tax by by calling a meeting of estate generals and by voting. That was it. So you know that estate generals, that were the representative from each state, and the meeting was called. And for when the meeting should be called, was the power only to the king. So the king had the power to call the meeting, but did not have the power to increase the taxes just by alone himself. And before 1789, the last time that meeting was called was 1614. So you could say that after a very long period of time, the meeting was being called. And at the palace and at the hall of the palace of Versailles, the preparations were made to host the delegates. And the estate general, there were 300 representatives from first estate as well as second estate, and in the third estate there were 600 representatives. And in third estate generals, the representatives were mostly the richer section of the society, the prosperous and educated section of the society. Women, peasants and artisans were not allowed, were denied to entry to the meeting, but their grievances and demands were brought up by the representatives in some 40,000 letters. So you could say that the meeting was being called, and the first estate general and the second estate general had to sit down facing each other, but the third estate general had to stand back at the back. So that was that was the kind of meeting that was being held. And there was a practice for voting, that was each estate general had one vote, that is 300% of first estate general representatives had just one vote, as well as goes for the second estate as well as goes for the third estate. And this time also Louis XVI was determined to do this, to continue this practice. But after that, what happened was that third estate general demanded for each vote for each person, and that was the idea brought by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his book. In his book he had brought this idea that was brought up by third estate general. So they demanded each vote for each person, that is the right to vote, as you know that. So but this was rejected by the king, and after that the third estate general ran out from the meeting and protest against the Louis XVI. And after that, the meeting was called on 5th May 1789, and there were around 2 months for the destruction of Bastille. And after that, on 20th June 1789, those representatives from the third estate general had now gathered in the indoor court of tennis of Palace of Versailles, and there they assembled themselves and declared themselves as the National Assembly. So the National Assembly was formed, and they now declared to form a constitution for the France, and which would place a limit to the power of the king, of the monarch. So that was the purpose of National Assembly. You have to remember, it was formed on 20th June of 1789. And the leaders that were leading the National Assembly were Abbesius and Mirabeau. So Mirabeau, who was from the noble family but was convinced not to have feudal privileges, feudal dues, and Abbesius, who was that church priest and had written a famous pamphlet, that is What is the Third Estate. So they both were leading the National Assembly, and after that the National Assembly was writing the constitution for the France and the citizens. The situation of the France was becoming more and more hectic. Now what was happening was that the production was becoming less and lesser, because there was severe winter season in France, as you know that. And after that there was scarcity of grains, there were so much high prices of the bread, and now in the shops the angry women stormed because they had to buy bread, but there were long queues for the bread, that because the prices were rising. So because of that there were long queues of the women in the shops, and in anger they stormed in the shops. As you know that on 14th July what happened was that they destroyed the Bastille, And after that there were many rumors that spread. There were rumors that the manors, the livers, the people who are living, the nobles who are living in manors have hired brigands and now are trying to attack citizens. So many rumors spread at that time, and because of that there were many protests, revolts that had been taken. As you know that on 14th July they broke into number of people, and now the Bastille was completely destroyed. So now you have seen the story behind the destruction of Bastille. And after the destruction of Bastille, after many destruction of government buildings, now people were now also attacking the Chatiaks. Chatiaks, that were the places, that were the palace of nobles or the kings. So now they were attacking those places, and because of the fear of the citizens, of the protesters, many nobles and clergy people were now fleeing from the country, now migrating to another countries. They were immigrating to another countries. So that's the story, you know, that's the story of French Revolution. And you know that many people, many nobles had fled to different countries. Because of that, Louis XVI had to adopt the constitution, had to adopt the National Assembly. After many protests, after the revolution, you know, after the destruction of Bastille, he adopted the National Assembly. He gave recognition to the National Assembly, and after that he also said to adapt the constitution that was being framed by the National Assembly. So you have seen the outbreak of the revolution. That's how the revolution outbroke, and also in a very large scale of manner. And you know that because of that, Louis XVI had to adopt the National Assembly as well as the constitution, that although it was not written, it was being written. It was completed in 1791, that we will discuss later. And when the National Assembly was recognized, was introduced, you know, that was recognized by the king, what happened is that all the taxes that were paid to the nobility and the, you know, that clergy people were now all denied, and the lands that were owned by the clergy were now confiscated. So that's the, you know, that because any person should not have the privilege from the birth. That was the ideas of the middle class that were growing. So now that we have seen the outbreak of the revolution, now we have discussed about the outbreak of the revolution. Now the subtopic is France becomes a constitutional monarchy. France becomes a constitutional monarchy. So as you know that now Louis XVI had recognized National Assembly, and the National Assembly completed the draft of the constitution in 1791. So after 2 years after the destruction of Bastille, the draft of the constitution of France was completed by the National Assembly. And now France had become a kind of constitutional monarchy, because the main purpose of drafting the constitution, of writing the constitution, was to limit the powers of monarch. And after the forming of the constitution, the power of all the government was not given just to one person, because earlier all the power was given only to the king, and after that what happened is that the powers were separated between, you know, that executive, legislatures and the judiciary part. So what is a constitutional monarchy? Let's understand it. So the citizens were divided into two parts, that is active citizens and passive citizens. Now passive citizens who didn't have right to vote, that is women or the persons below the age of 25 years. But active citizens were those citizens who had right to vote, and right to vote had been given only to those persons who were above 25 years and also who could pay taxes equal to the wage of 3 days of laborer's work. So persons who could give taxes equal to the wages of 3 days of laborer works were active citizens. Now 4 million people out of 28 million people had right to vote, that were active citizens. And now they chose electors. They chose some electors, and now those electors electors, they chose their representatives, active citizens chose their representatives, and those representatives elected the members in the National Assembly. That was the legislature part. National Assembly now had the right to make laws. That was the legislature part. And National Assembly controlled the king, the king's power. So you could say that king was the executive head. So the National Assembly had been controlling the king, and you know that king was placing limitations on his powers. And the same active citizens also elected a head for the judge, you know that, for the judiciary. So they also chose a judge. So you know that there was a kind of constitutional monarchy. There was executive, legislature, and the part of judiciary as well. But you know that there was one thing left, that is, not every person had the right to vote. Only the richer sections had the right to vote. Only those persons could be elected as the electors for the National Assembly who were the brackets of the taxpayers, And the Constitution of France started from the Declaration of Rights of Men and Citizens, and some basic rights like right to equality, equality before law, right to opinion, right to speech were given to persons. But you have to remember, Declaration of Men and Citizen, not to women, here only written as men. So there was some things that were left, and how were they occupied we will discuss later in this chapter. So now that we have seen that France has become a constitutional monarchy, but there were still some things that were left, like women didn't have the right to vote. And there were many opinions of persons as well that saw that it was wrong, because only electors were only those who were in the brackets of taxpayers. Now next subtopic is reading political symbols. Reading political symbols. So during the late 18th century, there were many people in France who could not read and write. So for them, there were some specified symbols to, to spread their views, and those symbols were, so first symbol is the broken chains. Broken chains, as you know, that were used to fetter slaves. So broken chains means that of freedom. They were the symbol of the freedom. Now next symbol was sceptre. Sceptre was a kind of, that was symbol for the royal power of royalty. So that was symbol for it. Next symbol that was used is that eye in the triangle radiating light. So eye in the triangle radiating light, this symbol means that eye is standing for the wisdom, that can see everything, is the standing for wisdom, and the rays of sun will throw away the clouds of ignorance. So that's the meaning of this symbol. Now next symbol is the red Phrygian cap. The red Phrygian cap is for the slaves when they are free, when they have the freedom, when they have occupied the freedom, they wear this cap. And next symbol is snake biting its tail, forming a circle, forming a ring. So you know that a ring has neither end nor starting. That stands for eternity. So this symbol stands for eternity. Now next symbol is red, white, blue. Red, white, blue, as you know, that are the symbols of France. Even in the flag of France you could see that. So a woman wearing that cloth, red, white and blue, is for the symbol of France. Now next symbol is the winged woman. A winged woman stands for the personification of law. Now next symbol is a law tablet. A law tablet is for, this symbol is for that the laws are equal for all people, and all people are equal before law. So these are some of the symbols that had been used, that during that time, during the late 18th century. So now that we have seen about the political symbols of the France, now next we will look at France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. Republic government, as you know, that a government where all persons of the government, even the head of the government, is elected. So the body of government is elected. That government will be called as republic. Like India is a republic country. So France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. And how did it become a republic? Let's discuss. So as you know that the Louis XVI had signed the constitution that was drafted by the National Assembly, but what he was actually doing was that he was in the secret negotiations with the King of Prussia and Austria. You know that with the King of Austria he had some family connections, and with Prussia also he was with some secret negotiations. And why was he in secret negotiations? Because he was not happy with the power of National Assembly. As you know that, just think about it. If you are the king and if you have the absolute power, but suddenly someone comes up and takes all the power from you, so it's obvious you will get mad at him. The same happened here. Now the king, the Louis XVI, had some secret negotiation, had gone with some secret negotiations with the King of Prussia and with the King of Austria. And the kings of those countries were also helping him, because they also didn't like the developments of the France, because they were also fearing if the developments in France have become so high, then the same would happen in their countries as well, and then the situation would be intense. So that's why they were also helping Louis XVI to stop those events that had been taking place since the summer of 1789. But the luck was not good. You could say that the luck of Louis XVI was not good. Always in the summer something happened. Now what happened was that is, in the month of April of 1792, they had elected, the National Assembly had done election, and after that they placed a war against those countries, against Prussia and Austria. They declared a war against Austria and Prussia, in whom with Louis XVI had been in some secret negotiations to stop the National Assembly. So you could say that his plan didn't work, and after that the war had been taken place, and many volunteers thronged to take place in that war from different provinces of France. And one of the patriotic songs that they sang was Marseillaise. Marseillaise was a song that was composed by Roger de l'Isle, and it was sung by the volunteers from the Marseillaise place that were marching towards Paris. They were marching towards Paris, and they were the volunteers for Marseillaise people. That's why the song got its name. The song got its name as the Marseillaise. And now at present time, Marseillaise is the national anthem of France. So you have to remember some events of France as well. Just as I have discussed about Marseillaise song, the national anthem of France. So you know that the war had taken place, and the kings of Prussia and the king of Austria, you know that, were defeated in those wars. But there were convictions, you know that people were convinced that the protest had to be continued, because the constitution, because the government was only for the richer section, not for the poorest section of the society, that were peasants, slaves, you know that, servants, artisans, women. Though this was you know that's why the protests were being continued, and there were many political clubs that had been formed. You know that the political clubs were also playing an important role in the protest, and the most important political club that rose the highest was Jacobins. Jacobins was also a political club that rose the highest. Jacobins got its name from the convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. So it got its name. You know that names have been taken from some events. So you have to remember that. So Jacobins was most important, most in power political clubs, and now all the members of that club were mostly the poorest, were from the poorest sections of the society, like the peasants, artisans, such as the servants, slaves that were working in someone's house. So there were the poorest people, poorest sections. So now you have studied that Jacobins was formed, and now they were becoming in more and more power. And after that, what happened that in 1792 they marched towards the palace of Tuileries, where the king was living, and the leader of Jacobins was Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre, also about whom we will discuss later in this chapter. So they marched towards the palace of Tuileries, where the king was living. They massacred all the king guards and imprisoned the king. And after that, the election was held. And from now on, elections were, the right to vote was given to every person above the age of 21, despite of all his wealth situation, whether he was rich or poor. This right to vote was given to every person, from every man, not women, only to men above the age of 21. And the elections were held, and the king as well as his family was imprisoned. And there is one thing that you should remember, is that when the Jacobins was in power, what happened that during that time nobles used to wear knee breeches, and the Jacobins were doing the opposite. They started to wear long pants that were showing that the rules of nobles have to come an end, now are becoming an end. And those persons who used to wear long pants and from the Jacobin clothes were called as sans-culottes, literally meaning those without knee breeches. So this is one thing you should remember. And after that, the king was imprisoned, and all his family members as well as were imprisoned, and after that he was also executed. In the month of January of 1793, he was executed in the public place. He had public execution. You know that in the palace of Les Concordes. So in that palace he had his public execution. And after that, Jacobins had now become an assembly for, as a legislature part, and the new elected assembly was now called as the convention. Convention was a new elected assembly as a part of legislature, whose work was to form laws. So now after that, France became completely a republic, not a constitutional monarchy, because the system of the king was abolished by the Jacobins. And Jacobins had now become, you could say that, head of the government, and now they were called not as National Assembly but as the Convention, because they were the poorest sections of the society. They now were ruling. They now had protested against the state, against the government, against the constitution that was only for the richer section of the society. So now our next subtopic is the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror. So the time period between 1793 and 1794 was considered as the Reign of Terror. And why was that period considered the Reign of Terror? Because during that time the spreading of terror was so much. As we know that during that time who were ruling over the France was Jacobins. Jacobins had now, Jacobins had now taken the government of France and now had made it a republic, a republican country. And Maximilien Robespierre, who was the leader, who was the head leader of the France, was, was a kind of massacre, who did massacre so much. You could say that he spread terror so much among the people of France. Now he arrested every person whom he saw as the enemy of the republic. Like for example, the richer people of the society, the clergy, the nobility, or you could say that are the persons from the opposition political party or even from his own party. What he did was that he arrested them and imprisoned them. and if the court of the France, they were found to be guilty, now what happened was that they were imprisoned and were guillotined. Guillotine was a device with two poles and a blade, and that was used for beheaded, for making a person beheaded. To behead a person, it was used. So you could say that the terror was so much during that time, and that's why it was called as the reign of terror. And that period was ruled by Robespierre. So his period was called as the reign of terror. Now Robespierre, Maximilien Robespierre, made many changes in the society of France, and those changes, there were many changes. Like for example, the wages and prices were fixed. Many peasants were forced to transport their goods to the city of the Paris and to sell there with the fixed prices that were fixed by Robespierre. And the use of high quality, high prices wheat flour was now forbidden, and there was only a use of equality bread, and in French it was called as pain d'égalité. So that was a bread that was called as equality bread, and now it was only used as bread. So you could say that there were many changes. Like for example, there were many things like equality before law, equality among people. There were many such things that were you could say that were spoken by Robespierre, but the methods to occupy them were very terrorist. That was not okay. And if we look at the tradition of France, the men were called as the monsieur, that means sir, and the women were called as the madame, that means madam. But after that, during the time period of Robespierre, what happened was that they were called as citoyen and citoyenne. That means citoyen, they both means the same, that is citizen, but for the masculine it was used as citoyen, and for the females it was used as citoyenne. So that there were many changes that were brought up by the Robespierre, and that's why that period was called as the reign of terror. And even the supporters of Robespierre were not okay with him. They wanted moderation of France, so they were not now supporting him. And after that, and finally in 1794 he was arrested, imprisoned, and on the next day he was sent to the guillotine to be guillotined. So you could say that the reign of terror was only from 1793 to 1794. Now our next subtopic is a directory rules France. A directory rules France. So after the rule of Jacobins was, now you could say that the Robespierre reign was ended, and after the rule of Jacobins ended, the whole power, the whole government of France was handed over the richer sections of the middle class. And now you could say that they changed the constitution completely, and now the right to vote was only to the persons who had the property. The right to vote was taken from the person who were non-propertied, who didn't have so much tax. So it was given again to those who were rich. So you could say that the constitution was changed, and now a new directory was formed, an executive of 5 members, so that all the powers should not be given only to one person that existed during the Robespierre reign. You know that during the Robespierre reign, what happened, that all the power collectively was given to only to the Robespierre. So that thing would not happen, and that's why a directory was made. Directory that was an executive of 5 members. But as always, between directory and legislature, there were always so much, you could say that there was always so much conflicts between them. And because of the conflicts of directory and you could say legislature councils, you could say that Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a general commander of the France troop, now rose into the power. He arose into the power and now became a dictator. He now became the dictator of France, and now he was conquering many countries. Now you have looked about the French Revolution. This is all about the French Revolution, you could say that. Now we have looked at the story of the French Revolution. Now we will see at different angles of the French Revolution. At last you saw that Napoleon Bonaparte, who arose into the power and now conquered many countries, and after that he was defeated in a war that was of Waterloo. That also we will discuss later in the conclusion part. And there were many events in the French Revolution as well that have inspired many countries as well, and you could say that were very important for India as well. So our next topic is, did women have a revolution? Did women have a revolution? So now till now we have looked at the French Revolution. We have looked at the flashbacks. We have looked at the story of the French Revolution. What were the reasons behind it? How did it happen? What were the conclusions? But now we have to look at it with a different angle. That is, did women have a revolution? So if I ask you, do you think they had revolution? They had participation in the revolution? Yes, they did have. From the very beginning, they participated in many revolts against the state for their own rights. Because you know that it was very important. Many women of the third estate had to work for their living. That is, many of them were seamstresses or laundresses, or many of them sold flowers, vegetables, fruits as well, and many of them were working as domestic servants as well. So you know that they were doing some work for their own living. They didn't have right to education. They didn't have access to the education to go to the schools like other men did. And even if the women of first estate and second estate had the right to education, their fathers sent them to the education, but a little after that they were arranged marriages of them. They had to marry them. So that was the situation of the women during the late 18th century, and that's why they participated in many revolts against it. And after that, you know that when the constitution was formed of 1791, every woman also criticized it. Every woman also criticized it because it was a declaration of rights of men and citizen, not for the women. Because women had also the basic right. They should also have the basic rights like right to live, right to education, right to expression, right to opinion. These all rights, right to freedom as well. So you know that was not given to the women, and that was also a reason for their participation in revolts, because it was their basic right that should be given to them by the birth. And after that, at first they were not listened, they were not heard by the government, but as the time passed, you know that some little demands were being taken by the state government, by the government of France. And after that, what happened was that many women started to go to schools. Many little girls started to go into schools. Now they could do jobs, could train themselves. Now they could become more, they were empowered a little bit. But still the revolts were being continued, because the main thing was the right to vote. They were also asking for the right to vote as well as for the electors as well. Because they, in the constitution of 1791 was what you saw that they were passive citizens, they were not active citizens. So that was also criticism. So that's why after that, finally in 1946 they had the right to vote. They got the right to vote, and after that in 1947, what was that? India got its freedom. So you could say that for every right of women in France, they had to fight for it. As for it goes for every right for them, like for right to vote, as well for right to education, right to expression, right to feelings, you know that all for these rights they had to fight for it, over it. So that's about the women. And many women who criticized the government during the Jacobin government, during the reign of terror, what happened to them was they were imprisoned and after that executed as well. And if we talk about the women revolutionary, there is one most important revolutionary, that is Olympe de Gouges. Olympe de Gouges was a revolutionary woman, and you could say that she was a very active revolutionary woman, because she also wrote a declaration of rights of women. That is, you know that many political clubs were formed during that time, but she was the woman who wrote her own constitution for the women, and in those the rights for women only were written. But after that, soon after, when the Jacobins were formed, the convention was formed, so she criticized it, and after that she was executed. She was guillotined in 1793 by the Robespierre government. So you could say that there was women revolutionary as well, there was women revolution as well. They did participate in revolution as well. Now next topic is the abolition of slavery. The abolition of the slavery, the most important, you could say that was also one of the most important reforms during the French Revolution. So if we talk about the slavery, you know that in the colonies of Caribbean there was so much good transportation, there was so much good exportation, good trade of the many things like salt, sugar, there were many things, and coffee as well. So these were being traded, and for doing so the European plantation owners didn't want to go there to that distant land, as well as you know that unknown land, unfamiliar land. So that's why they wanted to own some slaves, and there was a kind of slave triangle between Europe, Africa and America. And what happened was that the slaves from France were brought to the Atlantic, and there they were shipped together in a ship for voyage for 3 months, and from there they were taken to the Caribbean Sea. So you could say that there was a kind of triangle between them, a slavery triangle, but that was not right thing to do so, and that's why a little bit criticism of slavery also arose when the constitution was formed in 1791, and there were little questions about the slavery, whether they should continue it or not, but they didn't do so. The government of France, the state of France, didn't do so because they feared the big businessmen whose business was on the work of those slaves. Those slaves were working for the plantations, and that's why the business of those big businessmen, big investors was going on. So they feared the big parties of the France. So that's why it was not brought up at all. But after that, in the government of Jacobins, in the government of Convention of 1793, there was abolition of slavery completely. But their luck was not good, and after 10 years, when the Napoleon came into the power, the slavery was brought in. The slavery was again started, and after that, finally in 1848, the slavery was abolished completely. So you could say that there was also a long process for this abolition of slavery. Firstly, it was abolished, but after that it was still continued, but completely it got abolished in 1848. So now that we have discussed about the abolition of slavery, next topic is the revolution and everyday life. The revolution and everyday life. So if you have to connect the revolution and everyday life, how would you connect it? Do you think that the revolution and politics has an impact of the books that people read, or the language they speak, or there are many things like the clothes they wear. Now, the years following 1789 saw such changes in the lives of men, women and children. Now there were many changes that had been brought after 1789. The day when the French Revolution started, after that there were many changes that were brought, and many revolutionary revolutionary parties took that upon themselves, that there would be changes among citizens that would translate the ideas of liberty and democratic ideas, democratic policies. And one such law is about the abolition of censorship. Abolition of censorship, that is also one of the most important changes that took place in France. So you know that before the French Revolution, what was happening, what was the rule in France was that if there is any newspaper, magazine or any printed news that has to be spread, that has to be brought to the France, there should be approved. there should be approval of the censors of the kings. So only after the censorship, only after the approval of censors, that newspaper could be brought into the people. But after the French Revolution, in the revolution it was abolished, because in the constitution of 1791 there was right of expression, right to expression, right to press. So those rights were given to the person, and now they could spread their views by the views of pamphlets, magazines, newspapers, and many audios, poets, that poems that were also written during that time, many acts that were acted. So what was happening in France could now be viewed by every person, and person that were illiterate as well. So that's, you could say that the revolution had an impact, a very intense impact on the everyday life of a person, of every person of France. That's a normal thing. You should know that if there is revolution, it is for the change, and if there is no change in the everyday life, then what would be the revolution for? So that's the everyday life and the revolution. Now next and last topic of our chapter is conclusion. So the conclusion of this chapter, that Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the general commander in 1804, throned himself as the king, made himself as the emperor of the France, and after that he spread the ideas for liberty, democratic ideas, and after that he conquered many neighboring countries, but he was defeated in the War of Waterloo, that was in 1815. At the starting, people thought that his ideas were right about the socialism, about the liberty, about the democracy, but when they saw his invading troops, they now saw his terror, his fear. So that was about the Napoleon Bonaparte. But even his ideas had a very long impact on the people, even after his defeat. Even after his death, many people had so much impact of his ideas till a very long time. And the conclusion of this chapter is that we have seen how the French Revolution started, the story of the French Revolution. We had seen that the liberty and the democracy were the main two principles. Liberty, equality, democracy were the main two principles that had to be brought in the French Revolution. That was for the French Revolution. So you could say that the main two factors for which the French Revolution started was the liberty and democracy. These two were the main factors. This is the conclusion of the chapter. So now that we have discussed everything about the chapter, we saw that what is the French Revolution, what were the reasons behind it. We saw that in 1789 what happened was this. Let's see every date. Now you saw that in 1774 Louis XVI was crowned as the King of France. In 1791 the Constitution was brought, and after that in 1793 there was a reign of terror, that is Jacobin government, the Convention government, and in 1804 Napoleon Bonaparte took the throne for himself, made himself as the emperor of the France. And there are many more events and dates that we have discussed in this chapter that you should remember. So this is all about the chapter. I have discussed all topics and subtopics, and also this chapter is very important as for the competitive purposes as well. You know that the French Revolution also is one of the most important topics. So this is all about the chapter. I have discussed all topics and subtopics, and the next chapters of this book will be covered in next videos. So thank you very much.